On to the green state of Vermont with energy efficiency utility, Michael Dworkin and Blair Hamilton. We are down to our final three.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm Michael Dworkin. I am the chairman of the Public Service Board in Vermont, which is the state's utility commission. I want to start with a very basic point. Electricity is a wonderful resource.
System by more than 50%. The annual savings of $130,000 is helping their plant stay competitive and helping sustain more than 1,000 jobs in northeastern Vermont. We've built a technical and financial partnership with the 20 primary developers of affordable housing in Vermont to save energy in their projects. The result? Efficiency Vermont now participates in over 90% of all construction of affordable housing in Vermont, and we're already completing more than 6,000 units where low-income tenants.
I'm extremely impressed with the program and the both the reality and the potential, future potential of reducing energy use. What is less clear to me, and actually from, as best I understand it, slightly troubling, is the revenue, the production of revenue for supporting the program, which seems regressive. I mean, you're charging all electrical users in the state 1.5% to 2% on their electric bills. The major beneficiaries in terms of costs are the largest employers and large commercial users. 28% of them have taken advantage of the program. Only 2% of overall commercial users have taken advantage, and only 19% of residents have taken advantage. And I gather that from our evaluation that large employers like IBM can opt out if they want to.
I think maybe I should address that. First, we do charge as a percent of bill. We moved last year to something which would reflect the intensity of demand as well. So with higher demand, you would pay more. We've moved away from the regressive nature to something which is closer to percent of bill. It is not a progressive income tax type form, but it is seen as a cost of the total service and is no longer very regressive. The large users cannot opt out. One large user, which is IBM, has the option of a 70% rebate, but that's only if it does similar programs on its own and has them ISO 9000 certified. In essence, what it is that there's a set of technical capabilities which are so specialized for a few selective users that we offer a chance for them to do it themselves. And finally, I need to make really clear that the great value of the benefit accrues to everyone whose costs are reduced because of the reductions in purchase from the wholesale market. It's not because 28% participate or 52% participate. It's because the wholesale costs that get fed through their electric utility are reduced that the real savings accrue.
Do you have a follow-up, Carl?
The second part, is that because total demand goes down, or?
Yes, and it's worth noting that the costs on the wholesale market escalate in almost exponential function with demand. In other words, a 2% reduction in total demand is more than a 10% reduction in the cost of power.
Susan Golding?
You made a reference to California when you first started to talk, and one of our guideposts here is whether or not you could replicate this and whether it would show similar results. Could you do this, since you're obviously somewhat familiar with California and the problem there? Could you do this in a state like California?
As a technical matter, I think California's 2020 program, where if you had a 20% reduction, you got a 20 in usage, you got a 20% reduction in price, shows you can do it as an engineering matter. The harder question is, can you do it as a governmental matter?
Right.
I think the answer is yes. And the California effort of a few years ago ran into a problem with the state employees union, thinking it had to be administered through the state employees union. But once there was a real social crisis and a real social commitment, that formal problem was just literally put to the side and the state addressed it seriously. I am on the National Association of Utility Commissioners Committee on these issues. I deal with folks in Iowa, Indiana, Illinois. Many places think it can be done. Maine and many others have been asking Blair to come and talk to them, and you can talk a little bit further about that.
And we certainly, we got a call last month from Maine asking how they'd feel if they took the name Efficiency Maine, and they have set up something which is building very much on our experience. I visited Indiana last month, where there's a bill that's been introduced, spoke to regulators, utilities, and their House Commerce Committee about this kind of a model. Oregon has recently set up something that would similarly move from utility by utility approach to this to something that's statewide, and they've been looking to us for advice. And yes, we have gotten calls from a number of different parties in California who are looking at different aspects of what we're doing, because while the context is very different, the market barriers that are faced in California are no different than the market barriers we're facing in Vermont. And what works in that sense is highly transferable.
Ed Dorn and Susan Schwab.
Congratulations on your success. I'm wondering what your view is of state-by-state organization of this kind of effort. Vermont, after all, is a small state. You mentioned what may be going on in a couple of equally small neighboring states, New Hampshire, Maine. Has this experience caused you to think about the way we organize the delivery of utility services?
I think this is a classic issue of the laboratory of the states. You prove it works in one state, you prove it works in several states. Once it's proven, the national effort becomes feasible. In between the states and the nation, there's a reality that most people don't know in their daily lives, which is a set of regional power pools. Mm-hmm. For example, the New England Power Pool, right. Some of the western ones, the PJM, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland one. Those are logical areas for a collaborative, serious effort to move forward and would make a lot of sense. And some of our proposals to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as part of its standard market design were to allow purchase of efficiency services in the same way that they would socialize and pool purchase of backstop transmission. That, as you may know, Congress has largely put on hold, or seems to be putting on hold, what FERC will do with that. But if it moves forward, I'd have every hope this would be part of that.
I think one of the powers of what we're doing, though, is looking at what we're trying to do is change markets. We're trying to change decision-making. We're trying to change what happens with retailers of home appliances, for example. And in some cases, those markets are well-defined at a statewide level, and in other cases, they're regional. And we need to have structures that respond at that level.
And I think Blair put his finger on a very important point. Practically every hardware store and most of the supermarkets in Vermont sells energy-efficient light bulbs. It's a value you can't count by counting the number of rebates that get filed. What you count is the number of light bulbs that get sold and installed and used instead of something like that. And the benefit accrues from that, whether or not you have a rebate that shows up. But our count shows that when you move on a statewide or larger basis, you can change a market, you can change the options that people have in their life.
The result, for example, with that, in Vermont, over the past 3 years, we've now leapt forward to where we have the highest market shares in the country, 1, 2, or 3, for residential energy-efficient residential lighting, room air conditioners, refrigerators, and washing machines. Because of these kinds of efforts, we've shown you can do that kind of market movement.
Let me ask about your results, because obviously they look very impressive when you look at them here on paper. I have a question about causality and how this compares to, for example, what's been going on in other states. You, fortunately or unfortunately, during the period of time that this has been in place, you had the softening of the economy. And I'd be interested in knowing, what has happened to the Vermont economy and how Vermont's savings here, you referred to verified energy savings, compared to reductions in energy use elsewhere in the country attributable primarily to the softening of the economy.
I mean, certainly there are evaluation techniques which have to be applied here. One example would be in looking at what would have happened, say, with the sale of light bulbs had we not been offering the rebates. Multiple techniques were used, one of which was to look at the same chain store which was participating in Vermont and their level of sales relative to the same chain of hardware stores in Maine where they were not offering rebates and demographics otherwise seemed to be similar, to establish something that was at least a point of reference for what would have happened in the absence of the program. Similar techniques are used in most of the other impacts that we're looking at.
Blair's making an important point, which is that broadly speaking, there are two modes of verification. One is you look at econometric data and you say the statewide growth is higher or lower than New England or the Northeast, and then you adjust it for the fact that we had less of a recession than others. We look very good on that measure. But there's what I think is a better measure. You look at how many light bulbs are sold per capita compared to upstate New York or northern New England. You look at how many are sold in Aubuchon's hardware stores as opposed to Aubuchon's and other chains. You look at the fact that in appliance sales, we are selling more high-efficiency air conditioners, refrigerators, washers, this, that, and the other. And across the board, there's a hardware verification as well as an econometric verification.
David Osborne.
I have a couple of questions about the data. Your application says that in 2001, the verified annual energy savings were 36,894 megawatts. What percent of the total energy or electricity consumption is that in Vermont?
In a broad sense, it's a 1.9% or 1.8% for 2001. Do you remember the exact figure, Blair?
No, but we just
Well,
totaled.
That's close enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
How does that compare to 1999, the last year of the previous way of doing this, where the utilities were in charge of it?
The utilities were accomplishing for essentially the same budget about 2/3 as much, a little bit over half as much.
Thank you.
Just to be clear, we can wrap this up, but just so I understand I'm impressed with the results. I'm unclear about the innovation.
Maybe I could address that. For one thing, the key point is having a single-purpose entity which is rewarded on the basis of achieving verified energy savings. Almost nobody else is doing that. The next key point is doing it on a statewide basis. The next is doing it through a public-private partnership with a performance contract as opposed to a traditional electric utility or through a state governmental bureaucratic program.
Given to go back to Susan Golding's point then, Vermont is a relatively rural state, small population. How transferable, large state, California, another large state?
2 points to make. Vermont is the most rural state in the country in terms of smallest population living in dense areas. That actually makes this harder to do, not easier. Mm-hmm. And the second point is, don't think of Vermont as entirely bucolic. It has, for example, the world's largest semiconductor plant. It has very significant manufacturing and electric facilities, and places ranging from General Electric to locomotive manufacturing do exist and are real. The transferability to other states is something that looks directly achievable, and both the folks at the National Renewable Energy Labs and Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories think it is as well.
Our efforts and our savings are split almost 50-50 between the residential and the commercial industrial sectors.
Kathleen Kennedy Townsend.
I think of Vermont as a green state. I mean, it's
person as Bernie Sanders to as conservative a person as Governor Jim Douglas has shown that the attraction is not essentially political, it's essentially financial. When I go into a Commerce Committee of the Vermont State House small town bankers, they are primarily looking with their green eye shades on, not with their green T-shirts on.